Hello! Today we are making some sourdough bread. We've already made sourdough bread on this channel, but what we're doing this time, we're going to use some yeast to help it rise. Traditionally, sourdough bread is made with sourdough starter for both flavor and leavening, and using only the sourdough starter to leaven the bread. But if you're a beginning sourdough baker, you're just getting started, or you're thinking about starting, or if you were sick for a few days and your starter looks like this, you can still use it to add that sour flavor and add some yeast to help it rise. And it's great. Really, I use the yeasted sourdough during the winter because the colder temperature makes it kind of hard to leaven the sourdough just with the starter. And then in the summer, when it's nice and warm outside, it just pops up on its own with just the starter, and it doesn't need yeast at all. So that's the main reason that I use it anyway. It's for like the temperature change, winter and summer. If you already have a sourdough bread recipe that works really well for you and you just want to add yeast to that to help it rise, the rule of thumb is about half a teaspoon of yeast for every cup of flour. So you can really do this with any recipe if you have one you already use and like. But today I'm going to make the recipe that I typically use with just all-purpose flour because I'm out of bread flour and rye at the moment. So we're just gonna make that. We've made this before on my channel and I'll link the videos below. I'll also link the sourdough starter video that I made earlier if you're interested in those and more sourdough baking stuff. I think I also made banana bread. It's hard to keep track of all the things I do with sourdough, honestly. But I will link those below for you guys. And there's also a great article I found on King Arthur Flour's website about using yeast in sourdough starter or in sourdough bread. So I'll link that below as well if you want to give that a read. And one more thing, if you're interested in sourdough baking, there are other things you can use your sourdough starter for that are not sourdough bread. There's a great website called theperfectloaf.com that I stumbled on one time, and I'm so glad that I did. It has so many good recipes that I've used and really good explanations about how to make them. So it's especially good if you're new, but if you already have made several things, you know how to make bread, they're great recipes to keep around. So I'll link that website below as well. Now, there are people out there who say that if you use yeast in your sourdough bread, it's not sourdough anymore. And there are some people on the internet who will get very upset at you. They look at the recipe and they will go, yeast, heathen. So just be prepared that if you use a recipe for any sourdough and include yeast and you post it on the internet, there are those out there who apparently take offense to that. You're using the starter for the flavor, adding that like sour flavor instead of solely to leaven the bread. Big whoop. Did you make a delicious tasting loaf of bread? That's what matters. The moral of the story is make it how you want it, how works best for you, and if it tastes good to you and you made it in your own home, then who cares what other people think? All right, so without any further ado, let's make some bread. To begin mixing the dough, we'll combine 460 grams of all-purpose flour, 340 grams of warm water, 9 grams of salt, 92 grams of sourdough starter, and 3.5 teaspoons of active dry yeast for this amount of flour. The rule of thumb when adding yeast to sourdough is half a teaspoon of yeast for every cup of flour. However, most sourdough recipes are measured in weight, which makes this not a very straightforward measurement. So what I did was a little math and conversions to make this a little bit easier. A half teaspoon of yeast weighs around 2.8 grams. 1 cup of flour weighs roughly 120 grams. Rounding these both to nice easy numbers, I used 3 grams of yeast for every 120 grams of flour in this recipe, which is around 11 grams of yeast total. I'll put this in the description so it's easy for you guys to copy and paste if you would like to. Once all ingredients are added, we'll mix and knead the dough until a smooth ball is formed and the dough holds a nice round shape. The dough will be very sticky, and this can make it a little tough to deal with at this point. So I've found that having wet hands and working with a bladed hand where your fingers are together to scoop up the dough and fold it on itself and then push it down on itself again while rotating the bowl works best for me. You can also use the slap and fold technique if you prefer. Once the dough is smooth and holds its ball shape, we'll cover and let it rest for 1 to 2 hours until doubled in size. This is the part that's also nice about using yeast for leavening, reliability. If you've made other bread, you probably know the process of waiting a couple hours for the dough to double in size before shaping and then baking. It's used in many bread recipes and is very reliable. The yeast also isn't as sensitive to temperature as the sourdough starter is, so it'll still rise reliably even in a colder climate. Whereas sourdough starter might struggle a bit and take longer to rise all the way. Once the dough is risen, turn out onto a work surface and shape into a round or an oblong loaf, depending on what shape you're baking in. Cover and let it rest for 20 minutes. Preheat the oven and a Dutch oven or whatever vessel you're baking in at 450 degrees on the bottom rack of the oven. Flip the dough onto a piece of parchment paper, score and bake for 20 minutes with the lid on. Remove the lid and bake for another 30 minutes. Once done, remove and allow to cool completely before consuming and going into a carb crash coma. Ta-da! Yeasted sourdough. I cut off a small chunk from the side just so that I could see the inside, and I mean, I make this all the time, so I know it's delicious, and I'm gonna go make some avocado toast in a second. But it came out really nicely. I heard about and found bees wrap. I've only had it a couple days, so I can't speak to the longevity, but it's pretty cool so far. What you do is wrap your bread in it and then just use the warmth of your hands to hold it there for a second. And the wax or whatever material it's made of stays there and keeps your bread wrapped. Done. It's been working really well so far. I made this loaf 4 or 5 days ago, and it's still really fresh. And it's been wrapped in this the whole time. So it's working pretty well so far. I hope it continues. You can wash it in cold water, because if you wash it in warm water, that's the warmth is what makes it kind of mold and stick to itself. So you can wash it in cold water and then reuse it for up to a year. So I mean, this has been working out really well so far. If you like this video or you learned something, give it a like. If you'd like to learn more, subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.